Intelligences. We can now set out to reflect upon the intelligence of centers. Recall where it is noted in this work that centers in us do not work correctly. They interfere with one another, hypnotize each other, use the wrong energies in dysfunction, deal with the wrong things, and so on. The first step, therefore, is for us to observe centers, which is the first thing taught in self-observation or observation of the self. We must get to know what center we are in, or which center is interfering, and so on. This has to be done eventually as a formatory task, because our inner life has to be studied, sorted out, and then set in order. We all connect intelligence with the appreciation of meaning. Intelligence gives a relation to meaning. It conducts meaning. A feeling has meaning. A thought has meaning. A sensation has meaning. A movement has meaning, however these meanings are all different. Consider therefore whether intelligence and meaning are connected. Does intelligence not imply relationship to something through meaning? Because we cannot be intelligent either about nothing or about something that is meaningless. Each center relates to us differently through its particular function, then to the outer and inner worlds. With regard to what relates us to the outer world, the function of intellectual center as thought, of emotional center as feeling, of instinctive center as sensation, and of moving center as motion, are all quite different. They are four kinds of intelligence or conductors of meaning. If we see a snake, we feel a snake, we think a snake, and we run from the snake. This is sensation, emotion, thought, and motion, which are four meanings. This is four intelligences at work together. If you like, Plato's horse and horseness. Imagine a center that has no intelligence being formed in us. It would be a strange notion, and subserve no purpose. Yet there are centers in us, fully developed, that we do not know of because our level of intelligence is too low to comprehend theirs. We might assume in that case that they serve no purpose, which would be right if it were not for the fact that humanity is created a self-developing organism. That our growth depends upon contact with influences coming down the ray of creation from above us, then separating ourselves from forms of thought and feeling that hold us down to our present level. To become conscious in the intelligence of, say, our higher mental center would entail being permeated with forms of insight, with knowledge and understanding that are utterly extraordinary and quite contradictory to what we experience every day, hence it would be dangerous. The lower centers that we possess must be prepared and developed for a long time to begin with. For instance, we must learn to think in new ways and to separate from certain kinds of emotion. Recall a comment in the New Testament that the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, see 1 Corinthians, chapter 3, verse 19. And that the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. See 1 Corinthians, chapter 2, verse 14. A higher intelligence is not comprehensible to a lower one. The higher can understand the lower, but not the lower the higher. The higher mental center is at the level of the divine intelligence of the Sun, and works with hydrogen H6. Recall the table of hydrogen shared from earlier commentaries on this channel. Is a higher hydrogen more intelligent than a lower hydrogen? Or to put it a little differently, will a function such as thinking work better with a lower or a higher hydrogen? The answer is that it will work better with a higher hydrogen, if it can stand it. Consider for comparison a dragster running on nitro boost. Again, is a raw potato more intelligent than a cooked potato? No, it's the other way around, because a cooked potato can be food for man and stands at the position H768 in the scale of hydrogens, derived from the ray of creation. A raw potato stands lower, at the point H1536. Taking the psychic hydrogens, the lowest of which is 48, would a center working with this hydrogen be as clever as one that works with the finer, more subtle and quicker hydrogen 24? Certainly not. There are intermediate hydrogens. We do well to try to attract better hydrogens by not identifying, not losing our direction, and not basing our intelligence only upon what our senses show us. To be intelligent in a wider sense is to seek out sea influences. To be intelligent is to understand our position upon this earth. To be intelligent is to seek to transform the meaning of daily life for ourselves. As all of this opens us to higher meaning. All this increases the better hydrogens in us. Because it is all to do with different sides of self-remembering. We all have centers with their intelligences, however when someone possesses magnetic center they have more intelligence than one who has not. They are on a different level of being. They would not be surprised to find that C influences exist, and that life as we know it leads nowhere. They will be far more intelligent than scholars or professors and librarians. This is what intelligence means in the work, the position of something in the scale of being, and the influences to which it is open from the ray of creation. It is said in this work that each center has its own intelligence, so what then does that mean? When it is said in the system that each center has its own intelligence, it does not mean that each center has the same kind of intelligence. The work teaches that our three centers are three different minds, and in this regard it suggests that these three different minds should cooperate and assist one another. They should be like three siblings who live in harmony, each one good at something, and each one capable of helping the others to some small extent. We can begin then by taking each center as a whole. The intellectual, the emotional, the instinctive, and the moving center. It is necessary to establish for oneself that these centers have quite different minds. The mind of the intellectual center is, for example, very different from the mind of the instinctive center. The instinctive center is extraordinarily clever. It attends to the inner working of our organism in all of its 1,000,001 details, digesting food, healing wounds, looking after our temperature, regulating respiration and heartbeat, making and causing the internal secretions of glands to work in harmony, supplying this, taking away that, modifying this and increasing that, all of which happens continuously, 24 hours every day and 365 days of each year of our lives. All this regulation is far beyond the mind of an intellectual center. To be able to think of everything altogether like this is not characteristic of our intellectual center. The mind of an intellectual center is a singular thing, and it thinks of only one thing at a time, at the most two, but it is almost impossible for it to think of three things at a time. But there again the mind of intellectual center is quite different from the mind of emotional center. People say that our emotions are not logical. However, all emotions have their own logic, and it would be a mistake to think that the logic of an intellectual center is the only possible logic. To feel or sense a situation is very different from just thinking about it. The emotional center can feel, for example, the inner state of other people, which is hidden from the mind of an intellectual center. Our emotions can give us knowledge of others. The mind of emotional center can even be clairvoyant. Then again, a moving center has a different mind from any of the others. It is constantly making judgments of the most complicated sort, which are quite impossible for an intellectual mind to make. It can judge exactly and in what way and with what strength a pitcher must throw a ball to hit the catcher's mitt. It can drive a car, fly a fighter jet, perform extreme sports, all without intellectualizing. This is intelligent calculation. One can feel such calculation going on as it were in our muscles. Intellectual calculation is of quite a different nature and uses the elements of intellectual thought, such as words and numbers. The intelligence of our moving center, however, uses no words or numbers, and yet it can calculate with the most exquisite precision some complicated series of movements that will achieve a definite result. Observe Olympic diving events, or the routine of any professional gymnast as they talk to you about training muscle memory. Let's then consider the centers with regard to the way they receive things. We know that we can look at a beautiful picture or scene in quite different ways. You can look at a mountain as a beautiful object, in which case you have an emotional relationship to it. Or you can look at its formation from the standpoint of a geologist, noticing what kind of rocks and soil it is composed of, in which case you have an intellectual relationship to it. Or you could look at it from the standpoint of a climber, planning the line of your ascent and the amount of effort necessary, in which case you will have mainly a moving center relationship to it. It would be difficult to get a relationship to it through the instinctive center unless there were some famous restaurant at the summit. If we observe ourselves, we will find that we look at everything and everyone in these different ways. Let's say that we know all about the technical side of movie making, paintography, animatronics, and digitization, then we will tend to look at a film from this angle, and not from the emotional value of the story, and so on. The point is that everyone sees things differently, and each person can see the same thing differently at different moments, so that its meaning changes. A person's intelligence, in short, is made up of many different intelligences that connect with quite different meanings of the same thing. Take by example the parts of centers, their moving, emotional and intellectual divisions. Each of these has a different intelligence that gives a different relationship of meaning to the same thing. P.D. Ouspensky spoke about attention and how attention lies only in the more conscious parts of centers, not the moving or mechanical parts. The more conscious parts are our emotional and intellectual divisions. He said that ordinary attention, which goes here and there, is not attention at all. Only attention either attracted or directed for a long time is attention. We give too much attention to small things connected with the moving parts of centers. They can perform their functions almost by themselves, with zero attention. If we waste all of our attention on such trivial things, then we have no attention for big things, and so it will be a long time before we are able to increase our attention span. Ouspensky drew attention to a diagram of centers shared earlier in this commentary, and said that moving parts of centers are simply filled with small things, such as conversations we have heard, games we have watched, papers, posts, articles or blogs that we have read, movies, songs, videos and clips that we've watched. These things do not belong to us at all. However, when things fall on emotional and intellectual parts, they then belong to us and might even create something. Ouspensky observed that people who live simply in moving parts of centers, and so in small things, can never understand the work. In this regard he went on to say that the same idea or the same phrase received in moving parts of centers, in emotional parts of centers, and in the intellectual parts of centers becomes quite different, because the centers see things differently. He suggested taking some simple idea and trying to look at it from different centers, then it would become quite different in each. If the ideas of this work are only received by moving parts of centers, they cannot be understood because they are too big. Ideas of the moon eating us and of our sleep, of man awakening, and so on, are too big. If we allow ourselves to be always in the moving parts of centers, we cannot understand the work, we will take everything in the ordinary way and so on the wrong level. Ouspensky said that magnetic center cannot be formed in the moving parts of centers. Moving parts of centers can only take A influences, the affairs and the activities of our everyday life. B influences fall on emotional center, and C influences on intellectual center. By treating the matter in this way, we can see how things inevitably fall into their place. If people talk too much about the work, it puts it into the moving parts of centers, where it encounters zero attention. It would therefore be better for students in this work to talk about other things, rather than the teachings. The intelligences of moving parts of centers are adapted to their own small daily usage, therefore to employ them for understanding what is beyond them, or what demands the intelligence of an entire center, will yield no result, or entirely contradictory and incorrect outcomes. The intelligence of a center as a whole is made up of all the intelligences that compose its separate parts. The intelligence of an intellectual center as a whole is of a very high order. When the center is working as a whole, when every part is directed toward a common goal, then each subdivision shares in that effort and fulfills its own role. For example, the moving parts remember and register in words or figures the thoughts reached by the intellectual part and so on. However, ordinarily, only the moving parts of intellectual center are used by us, and these, working with hydrogen-48, are thinking only in terms of opposites, in other words, lacking any consciousness in third force and so producing very poor and dim-witted results. We could say that under ordinary circumstances the intelligence of our intellectual center is that of its mechanical division only, namely the formatory part. However, this does not cover the entire range of the intellectual center, parts of which work with hydrogen-24 and hydrogen-12. We can represent the passage from intellectual center to our higher mental center as illustrated. To become conscious in hydrogen-6 of the higher mental center would be to possess an intelligence far beyond and incommensurable with the intelligence of the formatory parts of our mind. All contradictions would disappear for one thing. There would not be any yes or no in our thoughts. All sides of a question would be seen simultaneously, and not one by one, therefore a state would be made beyond our personal experience. The work of instinctive center is interesting to study in the animal world. When, for example, a bird builds a complicated nest, it is doing this with moving center, however instinctive center is what directs the movement. It is noticeable that this sort of intelligence is not adaptable because the same mistakes tend to be repeated, and if, as in the case of a spider making its webs, something goes wrong, usually the whole thing has to be done over again from the beginning, because there is no power of adaptation. Each center opens onto a different level of the universe. Our instinctive center opens onto organic life. Higher mental center opens like a flower, to the level of the solar octave. The center that is most important to the material or incarnate body is the instinctive center, which controls the work of an entire organism. If its intelligence were interfered with, then the body would lack direction. The instinctive center tends to borrow force from other centers when illness sets in. It must keep itself going, and its duty is to fight with illness and to conquer it. For this purpose it controls vast armies and many weapons. It usually begins, as we all notice, by borrowing force from moving center. We know how we feel muscularly tired and lethargic, how our body aches before we are aware that we are ill. Then if the illness continues, the instinctive center borrows from other centers, usually in succession. When it takes force from emotional center, we become much quieter inside as a rule, then feel that it is impossible to bother about things, to identify with things. Because our usual emotion in life is to identify with everything. When instinctive center begins to borrow from intellectual center, we find that it is impossible to concentrate. We cannot read, cannot think, cannot manage our finances, and so on. In marked illness, in chronic disability, the real intelligence of the emotional center can become much more evident, simply because identifying is stopped. This is why people who are very ill and in mortal danger have great emotional insight into their lives, and their behavior towards others is markedly different. This is nothing to do with thinking, as when we think things out or reason about our affairs. Rather, it has more to do with actual insight or perception. The emotional center can see the quality of a person, for instance, whereas the intellectual center has to think about it. These are observations shared on the different intelligences of centers, however the subject is inexhaustible, requiring a lifetime of self-observation. The study of it only becomes practical when a personal study of centers is undertaken, not just for a few minutes but over a plethora of experiences.